Hi, I'm William F. Bryant, and if you've watched the business section of my Voped podcast, and listened to the Your Business segment, you probably caught how important marketing was to a company. I believe I mentioned that if people aren't aware of your product, they can't buy it. That's just a fact. And if you're competing in and amongst everybody else trying to make people aware of their products, it makes it even more difficult to pick your product out of that entire hodgepodge of people who are attempting to sell products. When you're going down your business venture, always look at what you are bombarded with as a consumer. It'll be extremely helpful for you to understand the customers that you are trying to reach and what they go through and how to better get to them so they can find whatever it is that you're offering. You always have to do your part to understand things from your customer's perspective. It'll give you a better understanding of what may work, and so you're not just throwing money down the drain when you're actually trying to find customers. I mean, anything that's useful and beneficial to you might be a good source to start from. I'm not saying that all the time, because there's plenty of people who really design a business for themselves and then they market it to an entirely different base that won't appreciate the exact same things that they like, and then they wonder why their business fails. And so you can't always use that. It just gives you kind of a base from where you can go from to kind of see if you're actually correct, and how you see it is how others see it. And so with that said, I want to kind of discuss the marketing aspect, just kind of a very top view of it and what you're looking at when you're doing it. So your marketing has to be adding value to your product and to your revenues, just like anything else that you put together. You can't be throwing away money because, well, I mean, then you're throwing away money and you're reducing equity in your company. If you're a small business owner, that doesn't do you any good, because that's money you could be using somewhere else. If you're running a company that obviously has shareholders, well, they're not going to be really happy with the usage of money if they find out that they're not getting the most out of the dollars they're giving you to spend. And that same can be said for if the company decides to finance with, corporate debt or commercial paper, or things of that nature as well. And so when you're looking at your marketing, there are different things that you can decide how much you're going to spend. Obviously, you can do a base amount. You can try to look for avenues and then, spend on what you find and where you want to put it. A number of companies actually, they do percentage of revenues generated, and they use that for their marketing base. And so they actually have a system that they look at share of voice. And so you can comparatively see who or how companies in your industry who would end up being competitors would spend their money, and more often than not, you actually see the ones who have the bigger market share oftentimes spend more money. And so there is a definite correlation between the amount of money that you spend and the amount of revenues generated to a degree. And you can kind of go further into that. If you're a small business, it's a little bit more difficult for you to do those kinds of things. You don't have money rolling in, or you can't really take out a whole lot of debt to run down this avenue to try to spend money to get people to see your stuff. So what you have to do is a little bit different. And I mean, all companies have to do this, but I mentioned this probably before, but you have to understand your customers. There's no way around it. You have to figure out who's going to be interested in your product. You have to figure out why they're interested in your product, and you have to find out as much as you can about the demographics that actually appreciate your products. You can figure out, who, what, where, why. You're going to be much better off, and much better off in terms of selecting where to place your money for the most effect when you're actually doing your marketing. As you can tell from the little speech I just gave on customers, I tend to kind of believe in the customer-driven marketing scheme. And that probably stems a little bit from my economics belief that it's a demand-driven market and supply cannot artificially create demand. There's going to be plenty of people who do economics who would argue an opposite point on that, but I've seen time and time again, demand has the money, demand will determine the benefits, demand will determine if there's any value, and then demand will actually, well, create that demand. Supply, I suppose if you look at the terms of behaviorally, the cheaper something is, the more someone might be willing to purchase something, or if they have an awful lot of discretionary income, they might purchase things. And so you can argue from that perspective, but there is just not a lot of supply-driven, real supply-driven markets. And I also want to mention this now because when you actually do go into times of increased inflation, you do not have supply-driven markets. And what's worse is when we combine the inflation with strained supply and supply chain bottlenecks, you definitely don't have supply-driven markets. You've got everything kind of all out of whack and haywire. And so that aside, I definitely believe in a customer-driven or customer-derived and demand-driven marketing scheme. And so your entire goal as a company is to understand your customers and what their needs and wants are in a product that you are in the industry of offering, and then provide that for them. In that way, you are creating the supply to meet that demand. And I guess some people might argue that that's a supply-driven context, but I still, once again, you're really just identifying a demand that is there and then providing that supply for it. Without the demand previously existing, then there would be no point to having the supply. And I know this kind of is out of the wheelhouse for some people to understand, but it does go in and it does play into this entire thing because you providing the goods, that's your market exchange. You have to understand a little bit about the behavioral aspect of that market exchange. So, understanding your target customer. And like I said, you have to understand who's buying it, why they like it, what they see in it, what values they're getting from it, where they're buying it, and what is really kind of driving them to choose your product over someone else's product. That customer-driven component will then also, like I said, will optimize your dollars that you're spending on things. Where are these customers? Do they listen? And I'm sure a lot of people are this way too. I don't think, and number one, internet advertising dollars don't go the distance. They just don't. You throw things on Facebook or Google or YouTube or any of these other things, and once again, what you do is what a lot of customers do. If you just click through things and you don't pay attention, or because you're so bombarded by things, you don't want to listen or see it, your customers will probably do the same thing too. You have to begin to understand what will cause them to stop on your product. And so that's not to say that you can't use those different internet areas to market your goods. Especially if it's the only thing that's in your range. But then you really have to examine the tools that they have available for you to narrow down your region and any demographics associated with your customers so that you actually can hit those people with your marketing campaign. And they're actually going to be the ones most likely to actually stop and take a look at what it is that you're doing. One of the other things, now, TV was always the big one. Huge money was spent on commercials. And of course you can see why. For a given show, you might have 12, 15 on a really hit show, 17 million people sitting down at prime time watching this show. And so even if somebody wasn't in the market to buy whatever your product was, they might be down the line, and you're going to hit a huge swath, a big percentage of them all at once. And so that's where a lot of TV commercial advertising really kind of got its run from. And the reach then obviously was in any other places that got major circulation. So you have your newspapers, your magazines, and so on. The industry has ways to measure the reach or the suspected reach of the marketing campaign and the advertising, and the number of times somebody may have seen it, the likelihood of purchasing. There's a number of metrics that go into it that are trying to justify your expenditures in that market segment. But once again, you have to consider the fact that every time you spend money, the person who is selling you something is generally dependent upon you purchasing whatever it is they're selling, because that's their product to you. And so when you're looking at any kind of numbers that somebody is giving you as far as reach, they may be telling you they're good, but you really should look deeper into it and say, okay, well, what do these numbers really tell me? Because statistics derived from formulas may not be telling you what they're saying they're telling you, if you understand what I'm saying. And that just goes for everything. But nonetheless, you can be hit with all kinds of numbers that give you, hey, it's this reach and this many people are likely to see it, there's a lot that goes into it. But marketing is one of the most difficult areas in which to assess whether the money you're putting into it is actually getting you anything back. And so because companies get really upset with the amount of money they're dumping into things, marketing has come up with all kinds of metrics to try to show you that it is actually effective. That's not to say that it isn't. Like I'm saying right now, it is. It's the only way you can get people to purchase your product. Awareness is key. You just want to make the most of the money that you're putting into it. Going back to it, you have to know your customers. It's key. You have to know your customers. The next C, there are 3 C's for marketing. It's going to be your competitors. It's important to understand the competitors that you have in the industry. And it's not just the products that they sell. How do they sell them? Where do they put them? Their distribution. Are they online only? Do they have retail chains? Do they have brick and mortar? You want to understand who it is you're up against and what they offer when they're selling their products. The better that you understand them, the better that you're going to put together their overall marketing plan and strategy, and then you can kind of assess if that's working for them and how much of it you want to kind of duplicate in your marketing plan and strategy. Because if you are a new company going into something and somebody that already exists within that industry, the fact that they're still in that industry, and if they've been in there for a substantial amount of time, means that there are probably things that they are doing right. Just simply markets, if people don't like what you're doing, they're not going to buy your product and your company's going to fade away. So if you can stay in a market and stay competitive, that says an awful lot about the way you're organizing things. So somewhere in there, they're doing something right. It may not necessarily be their marketing, but it's something you need to pay attention to, which is why you go in and you actually do kind of a competitor assessment, and you comb over their data. And obviously they're not going to give you their data, whatever data you can find, and try to glean as much useful information as you can especially when you're new, as you're going to enter into this endeavor. And like I said, it's probably best not to just start off and jump the gun and do something without having done planning and research into the myriad of areas of business, so you have some understanding of what's going to come at you. And that, it's a real loose, basically, kind of risk assessment, because you are going to have all kinds of things come up and you're going to have to address them, and each one of these poses their own issues and problems, just to kind of like throw this out there. But once you've understood your customers and you've understood your competitors, it gives you somewhere to go when you go and you do your next C, which is the core strategy. Now, I'll go into these certain pieces of these deeper in further segments. I'm just, like I said, just kind of doing a real top base looking at this. So you're looking at your core strategy. Your core strategy is going to present your value proposition. Why should people buy your product, and what benefits and values does it offer that somebody else doesn't? Now, this is going to be presented in your 4 Ps, as they call it, that you are going to determine to carry out your strategy. And that'll be the price that you actually set your product at, any promotions that go along with your product, the position which you put your product in the market, and I'll mention that in a second, and of course it'll be any product differentiation that you decide to put on your marketing when you're actually pushing it out there to people and the customer face. So pricing is complex, and I'm going to do an entirely different segment on pricing. But the idea is that, of course, you have costs that go into creating your product. And there's a number of different ways to measure costs. And it really depends on how mature your company is and where you're at in the entire phase of production when you're actually looking at costs and what you want to include in your costs and what you don't, and what industry you're in. So the basic idea, however you determine what your product costs, obviously you have to charge more than that. But you don't want to charge less than what customers perceive as the value of your product. So if it costs you $10 to make something and you want to charge $15 for it, that's okay. Yeah, you're going to get money back. Now remember, that's however you determine your costs. So that's a different segment. But if you want to charge $15, okay, yeah, you're going to make some at least operating profit back if you're covering all the rest of your expenses. Now, if the people see it as being $20, though, if they're like, wow, yeah, somebody else makes something similar to this and they charge 22 or 23, and yeah, I'd be willing to pay 20 definitely for it. This one's good. Maybe it doesn't have this, but it's got this. And so the way a person perceives the value or the benefit that they're going to gain from your product, maybe they would pay more. Well, then you're underpricing what you could get for the product. And that's where pricing is a little bit tricky, because you do want to incorporate in how much value does somebody actually get from your product. And then if enough people who get this value are available to purchase your product, and then that'll give you the total revenue generated from it. And so there are some definitely further deep dives when you're determining pricing. When you go into promotions, that's a little bit more heavy duty. If you are actually distributing or you're selling to wholesalers and you're going to do promotional support on the product, and you're going to offer discounts for bulk purchases, or you're going to do rebates and coupons, that in and of itself also takes a lot more of a deep dive when you do offers and sales and specials, and the more people that you're working with in your distribution chain, and the more chains you're using, which is just simply how you get it to your customers. That's all it really means. The more avenues that you take, the more you have to look into that, because just because somebody has a retail chain obviously does not mean they need to carry your product. There are tons of other products they can carry, and they probably are all in your industry. And so if you don't offer some kind of support to motivate them to carry your product, then they probably won't. And that's where the promotion part comes in. Now, like I said, I was going to mention positioning, because this is a little bit, it sounds funny at first because you think of positioning, like, what do you mean, position on a shelf? Or something like that. But, and maybe you didn't, like, the very first time I heard it, it flashes in your mind, like, really, what do you mean? No, but it is kind of a funny word. It means positioning overall is how you want people to perceive your brand, and that your product is going to be representative of this perception. And so if you're looking at high-end luxury goods, that's what you want to push. And that's pushed in the way you handle your marketing. You don't see high-end luxury automobiles, bumping around on beaches or running through sand dunes and, trying to be something that they're not, or that they're not pushed to be. No, you see them at elegant parties and lavish hotels and really cool, drivers that are wearing tuxedos, or, it's pushing luxury. It's pushing a status. It's pushing something. It's pushing something that they want you to associate the company and their products with. All right. Now you take something the other way and you look at Walmart, for example. Well, Walmart wants to be known for carrying a whole lot of products at the lowest prices you can possibly carry them. And so they take an entirely different aspect. Their entire campaigns are always lower prices, and, huge buildings with as much as you can have on the shelves, and, the fun and easy shopping for families to stretch their dollars. And that's what they're known for. So when people have these scenarios crop up in their mind that they're going to, have to go and do or partake in, then that's the product they think of. Like if somebody has a special dinner to go to, well, you want to portray that luxury or that brand or that elevated status. And so then the brands that you associate with that are the ones that you would look to shop for. It's no different than any customer that you're going to push. So you have to determine where your product sits in and amongst all the other products that yours would be competing with. The competition part on this is actually a little bit even more so than just direct products, because say, for example, breakfast cereals, breakfast foods are used an awful lot in comparing competitive products. When you sell cereals, yes, you're competing against cereals, and there's a number of types of cereals. You have kids cereals and fruity cereals and healthy cereals and all kinds of different ones that even in your mind you're going to associate certain cereals with certain things. But cereals don't just compete against cereals. Cereals compete against bagels and toast and bacon and eggs and sausage and all of these other things that you can choose to eat for breakfast. And granted, some of these things are a little bit farther outside as you think about things that could possibly be used, but you do compete against anything that can possibly be substituted in for your product. And so when you do position your product, you also have to consider these things as well, in addition to when you're doing your pricing. So positioning a product, and I wanted to mention the difference between the luxury and Walmart, because just because your product is economical does not mean it's bad for your company. It doesn't tarnish your image. You just want to see where people see your product, because you see your product and this is where you start from. But you want to make sure people are seeing where you see your product. And if they don't see it the way you do, you need to make adjustments. Either you need to meet where the people see it, or you need to elevate where they see it at. And that's important, why you have to continually maintain a relationship with your customers. And you'll note that there's customer relationship software that helps you do some of this stuff if you've ever done any kind of resource software. So The positioning aspect is important. It goes back to and interlocks with understanding your customers, seeing how they see you, and hoping everything is gelling, that everybody's on the same wavelength. Now, as you have been, as you are more established and been around for longer, then you have a really good idea of exactly where you're at with your product. Somebody who's newly starting out has to just simply pay more attention to this and just be aware that this is an area that exists when you're actually doing your marketing. Even if your customers aren't conscious of it, it exists in their behavior and how they see your company and how they're going to approach your company. And so you do have to understand this, and you do have to know a little bit about this. All right, and then the last piece, which I mentioned, just the product. Well, when you have your product, you go in and you need to differentiate your product from other products. Sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes your product is so similar to other people's products that there is no real differentiation. So maybe the only thing you do is differentiate the package. Or maybe your product is very complex, or it has many different product lines that offer variations on your product. A lot of technology devices do this. And so understanding what it is about your product and what you're going to present is important. When you go about presenting it, you need to understand how people respond. This is why they do studies and ask people questions. For example, a lot of studies find that numbers are great with people, which is kind of an interesting thing because so few people seem to appreciate math and numbers, but they just appreciate higher or lower numbers depending on if something is good or bad perceived to them. So with toothbrushes, for example, if something is reaches 30% deeper and cleans 50% better, well, those are things that people are like, wow, okay, great. And it actually, works better with the product and describing what it does than saying, it's the most advanced product on the market or something like that, because people see and associate the benefits more quickly. Which also brings me into a little bit more on the product when you're actually determining what it is you're going to say about the product and whether or not you can differentiate it and mention the value available for people, is how complex is the value that people will get from it. Because when you actually determine how you're going to carry out your strategy and mention these things about your product, you have to figure out if it's something that is informational, that has to be absorbed by people, and how often they would have to hear your message to really understand the benefits. And so the entire idea behind it isn't just awareness, which is important, but it's also presentation, how well they remember it. Marketing is extremely complex. So while sometimes it feels like you're throwing money down a rabbit hole, you really have to feel for your marketing team, because they have an extremely difficult job, but they should be, even if you do it for your small business, it's an extremely difficult job. There has to be a certain amount of a systematic approach, so you can keep track of what's working and what's not working, because you want to make the most of the dollars that you're spending in this area. And the only way to do so is to really kind of keep notes and keep track of what's working and what's not working, and give it a certain amount of time that is there's a certain amount of time for it to run to determine if it's working or not working, because not all marketing campaigns are going to be immediate, and it really depends on what you're doing with your campaign. If you've ever heard of direct approach marketing, that's a little bit more immediate. It's a direct message to a consumer that you are figuring that they're going to have a response on, bearing in mind that they're in the market to actually buy your product at that given moment in time. So there's a lot of stuff, but it's good to mention and good to think about this area. And like I said, I'll go deeper into some of these areas on marketing and some of the other segments in a business, to just kind of cover them, to get people thinking about what it is that goes into certain areas. There are effective relationships and and regression and statistical techniques that can go in to help improve your marketing. But I won't really go into them right here because honestly, understanding what it takes to develop a marketing strategy and the tactics that go into it will get you quite far. Just simply kind of like on a thinking level, jotting down notes, planning things out, and then going back and assessing what it is that you can really do in terms of financing your marketing campaign. And so it'll give you a place to start from. In addition, though, there are a number of, and I know I'm not huge with tech stuff, but, and not from that perspective, but when you don't understand what goes into it. But when you're just starting out, if you're on an entrepreneurial level, you don't have to really go on the really deep understanding of the math behind it. Or any of the statistics behind it just yet. And you really have to kind of get your feet wet, get running, and determine what markets and where you're going to put your money at first, and what's going well, what's not going well. And as you begin to find these areas, then you have to go into deeper assessment of what's going on. And then and so hopefully this segment covers some of the basis on what a marketing approach for a product or product line entails, and what your job would be as an entrepreneur if you're pushing a product of some sort, what you actually should go through before you just start putting internet ads out there and hoping that someone's going to be responding to them. Remember, anything that you do, you are a customer too. So the way other companies approach you, you should pay attention to and take notes on and reference some of the things that I mentioned, because then you can hopefully apply some of those things back to your company as well. All right, thank you.